So again, welcome everybody to this session. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about global policies about chemicals and how they relate to our work in Massachusetts and as toxic use reduction planners. Before I get going, I want to just go ahead and introduce Bashkut Tunjak. He's the director at TURI, and Bashkut's going to be moderating this session. If you could all go ahead and in the chat, just say who you are and what company you're with. That would be helpful for Bashkut and Mikael to get to know you. We also have some polls, and we're going to be doing breakout sessions. So go ahead and introduce yourselves on chat, and Bashkut, please feel free to take over.
Thanks, Pam. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. It's a great pleasure for me.
You're on mute, Bashkut. There you
go. Good morning again, and good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. Again, my name is Mikael Tunjak. I'm the director of the Toxic Use Reduction Institute here in Massachusetts. It's a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to introduce to you Mikael Karlsson, who's an associate professor at Uppsala University in Sweden in the Department of Earth Sciences, Natural Resources, and Sustainable Development. He's also leading a program on climate change leadership. I had the opportunity to hear about some of Mikael's recent research on climate denialism just a few weeks ago in Sweden, which was truly fascinating. And it was a great conference overall. And we heard a great deal about many of the developments that are happening both in Europe and at the global level around pollution and health. And it's a really a wonderful opportunity for us to have Mikael today to hear some of his perspectives on these topics. Just by way of background, I met Mikael many years ago, maybe over a decade ago now, when he was the executive director of an organization called the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, or SSNC. I won't try to say that in Swedish. But he also served at the same time as president of EEB, which is the European Environmental Bureau, Europe's largest umbrella organization of environmental NGOs working in Brussels on European policies. My friend and I were lucky enough to do a project with Mikael and his colleagues around the global regime for chemicals, and it was a fun opportunity, and Mikael was a tremendous partner in that. We at TURI have, I would say, benefited tremendously, I think it's fair to say, from a lot of the progress that has happened in the EU. Whether it's been the information on hazards that's been generated, or the impetus for change, or an inspiring vision for a non-toxic environment. I think what happens in Europe is quite relevant to us and our work. And not only has the European developments benefited us, but also the global developments as well. In just the past few months, we've seen a new global chemicals framework, the GCF, which is to succeed the strategic approach to international chemicals management, or SICAM, for the coming years. We also simultaneously have discussions on a science policy panel, which would be akin to the IPCC on climate change, but for chemicals and wastes at the global level. And in just a week, or less than a week now, we'll have the third round of negotiations on a plastics treaty, all of which is happening irrespective of the other treaties on chemicals and wastes. So it's a very packed agenda at the international level. Anyway, it's a lot to discuss, and without taking up more time, I'll be turning it over to Mikael in a moment. But perhaps before I do, Pam, would you mind sharing the polls that we have prepared for you to get things started?
Sure, yeah, we have two polls, so I'm going to go ahead and launch the first one. now, and if you could go ahead and respond. We're just asking, how do you stay abreast of policy shifts happening outside of Massachusetts or the US? Okay, just another second or two. If you haven't responded, please go ahead. All right, I'm going to end the poll. Let's see. So it looks like most of you are learning either from email lists that you're on or from the TURT program itself. There's several who mentioned other resources that are used, and maybe we can just take a moment if anybody wanted to share what that other outlet that you use is. We can give you a moment to do that. You can unmute yourself if you want to share.
Hi, Pam. This is Chris at Transine. It's a little bit maybe unconventional, but a big driver for us is our customers. So we sell mainly into the semiconductor industry, and they're very much up on international regulations for restrictions of chemicals, and they're constantly sending us questionnaires and surveys. This is the latest update. Do the products comply with this? I can't help but be hit over the head with what the regulations are by our customers.
Interesting. Yeah, and Denise also mentioned international customers as a resource. Any other outlets that you'd like to share? Anybody? Go ahead, Bill.
Nothing new, really. It's just the options that we were given. If you had all the above, I would have checked that, but we didn't have that option.
Oh, okay. Great. Fair enough. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that poll. And then we have another poll that I want to go ahead and launch. If I can get myself back to where the polls are. And this is just asking, this is just asking who you are. So where are you in the global supply chain? Are you an original equipment manufacturer? Are you a tier 1 supplier or a tier 2 supplier? Are you not sure where you sort of fit in that? If you're a consultant, maybe your answer is other, and I see many people are doing that. So again, I'll give it just a minute and then share the results. Looks like we have a handful of OEMs, a handful of tier 1 suppliers, a handful of tier 2 suppliers. Several people who maybe aren't sure where they land in the global supply chain. And I imagine that maybe the majority of the folks who answered other maybe are consultants, but if there's somebody who answered other who is not a consultant, and if you'd like to share, that's great. Again, and all of the above. Okay, good enough. Thank you so much for doing that. That gives us a sense of who's in the room, and Mikael, who's less familiar with all of you than Bashkut and I may be. So, okay, off you go, Bashkut.
Well, thanks, Pam. Well, that's all from me. Mikael, maybe I could turn it over to you to speak a little bit about the EU developments that we've seen over the recent months and years, if that's okay. Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Bashkut, and thanks for the collaboration we're having. And I also need to say that even though you were modest enough not to say so, you gave a brilliant keynote speech in the chemicals conference here in Uppsala just a couple of weeks back. So It was really inspiring to hear more about that work. Well, I've spent the last few days in Brussels in preparing and carrying out a seminar about bioenergy and bioenergy carbon capture and storage issues, but I also met some previous colleagues in different places in Brussels and heard a bit more about what's happening in chemicals policy. So I will come to that in a while, but perhaps first start and give you a brief background on EU's chemicals policy when it comes to, let's say, industrial chemicals policy that came already in the 1960s. Different types. We had stipulations focused on classification and labeling. We had restrictions or management provisions for using pesticides, and eventually much broader regulatory frameworks emerged, focusing on industrial production of chemicals. And over the years, this led over to what was called the existing substances directive, that contained a bit more than 100,000 substances. Eventually, the bodies in the European Union realized that we need to deal with this so-called burden of the past. So in 4 different lists, 1 in 1,000 of these substances, a bit more than 100, were put into a process divided by the different member states in the EU, according to which health risk assessment and environmental risk assessment was to be done. This was a very lengthy and expensive process. It took a number of years to produce these 500, 600, 700 pages of risk assessments. They were negotiated in different ways between the member states before they eventually mostly became adopted, and that led, depending on the outcome, to a drafting of risk reduction strategies, and sometimes even slower process. Substances that came more recently were in another directive for new substances. All this was seen to be clearly inadequate, not only from environmental and health point of view, but also problematic for companies, and the administrative burden was heavy, and all this led into an idea to develop a new system in which existing and new substances were put in in the same regulatory framework. And the first idea, the fundamentals of the REACH regulation on restriction, evaluation, authorization, registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of substances came in 2001 in what the Commission calls a white paper. The draft regulation came in 2003, and eventually in 2006, the legislation was in place, operative in 2007, and was intended to be implemented over 11 years. But after half-time and 10-year evaluation processes had been undertaken, the idea was to go for REACH 2.0. Around those years, when REACH was drafted and debated in political circles, it became the most lobbied proposal in all policy fields in the history of the European Union. It was a perfect storm, according to some scientists, and I followed that process quite close, and saw how risks tended to be underestimated, and regulatory costs were overestimated. One estimate said, for instance, that more than 5 million workers in chemicals industry in Europe would be unemployed, which was actually more than the number of persons employed in total in chemicals industry. So politicians try to orient themselves in this polarized, politicized landscape, which was difficult. The speed in terms of assessing and further managing chemicals increased somewhat after REACH was enacted, but the evaluations that have been done both by agencies, by the Commission, by researchers, still clearly show that we're not reaching the environmentally and health-related objectives, and there are shortcomings also from a business point of view, in particular for downstream users, but also for chemicals industry. It's a Bastillion in a way, this huge REACH regulation. I think that one reason why it became so comprehensive was that it was going to survive artillery from chemicals industry when they tried to sort of undermine it and shoot it down. Not much happened in the previous European Commission when Jean-Claude Juncker was chairing the Commission. He had the idea that EU should be big on big issues and small on small issues. And climate was a big issue, but the rest of the planet and health was a small topic. So we didn't see much progress. But Ursula von der Leyen, who became Commission President for about 4 years ago, she set off with a European Green Deal. This is Europe's man on the moon moment, she said, with the Climate Act, the most comprehensive climate policy package, from farm to fork, biodiversity strategy, circular economy, and a lot of things, and zero pollution initiatives. And within the zero pollution initiatives or related to that, eventually the chemical strategy for sustainability came, focusing on the objective of a toxic-free environment. A long list of action points was added, focusing on cocktail effects, on consumers, on perfluorinated substances, on innovation, on the global level, on specific substances, one substance, one assessment. So there were both conceptual, clearly regulatory ambitions and ideas on how to revise, but also complement with new approaches. And we've seen this over the entire spectrum of policies relating to sustainability. But there has been a lot of progress in terms of climate policies, circular economy to some extent, biodiversity to some extent, but we have not seen that much, with a few exceptions in the field of chemicals policy. Classification and labeling, that's an area where policies have moved. Definition of nano, mercury, improved process for restrictions under the existing REACH. But what more or less everyone had been waiting for, namely a proposal from the Commission on an updated REACH regulation, hasn't come. And the Commission has the initiative for new laws. And initiatives for new laws are sent to the Parliament, which represents the public. It's directly elected, and then we have the Council representing the member states. So in a way, it's like the Congress, two chambers, if you want. So a proposal was promised in 2022, and then in 2023, and then in the end of 2023, 2023. But just a couple of weeks back, the Commission's work program for next year came, and REACH is not there. All the other elements that were most of the other elements that were originally sort of promised or set out in the strategy from the Commission were absent. And I think this has to do with a number of things. One is that some member states have been increasingly critical. Some member states have favored an approach called better regulation, something that's been going within the EU. Usually that means deregulation. We have already a too heavy burden on implementing climate policies, is something that some member states say. There's a lot of criticism from industry. It has decreased a bit, but the different directorates, as it's called in the Commission on Environment and Health and Growth, have been fighting on how to present the structure and the new draft for a new REACH regulation. We also see a political climate in a number of member states, including in Sweden, where right-wing populism is increasing for a number of reasons. And in parallel with that, we see criticism of environmental policies more broadly. And if you take all this together, that some member states are increasingly critical, right-wing politicians are increasingly critical, and we have elections in the European Parliament next spring, and a new Commission coming in next year for a mandate period of 5 years. Those who attract voters or are supported by countries, let's say, if we make this big black and white, which is not, but on the industry side, they feel hampered and are reluctant to present something new. Those that favor more stringent environmental health policies have also realized that probably not much will happen during the rest of this period with the Commission. So therefore, we stop calling for new proposals because we make this a key issue in the election campaign instead. So both those who want to block and who want to see new legislation are sort of taking it easier. And for that reason, there won't be a proposal now before there will be a new Commission, which in practice is at least 1 year, even though all the documents actually are there. Even though everybody realized that we have combination effects, even though everybody agrees that we cannot regulate one substance at a time. And linked to that, that REACH is focusing on individual substances, a number of member states on the 30th of January this year submitted a proposal to restrict about 10,000 variations of PFAS. That came from Germany, Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands, and Norway, which is outside of the EU, but within the European Free Trade Association, the collaboration. This proposal goes now, it's under the ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, which has a risk assessment committee and a committee for socioeconomic analysis. And they have sent out this for comments for half a year, and the number of comments goes above 5,600, if I remember correctly. And that's now going through this. And this has led to an enormous debate, again, which resembles the debate we had 20 years ago over the REACH regulation. And it reflects the same type of understanding, which means that those fearing new costs are very critical. Downstream users are comparative, and forerunners among companies are comparatively quiet. Environmental organizations are criticizing. So it's the same thing. So this is actually not about PFAS, but what about who should decide which substances should be out there in the market? How do we look at risk and inherent properties? What is precaution not? Can we use default values with a group perspective or not? And we see, as previously then, cherry picking, denial of science, a lot of exaggerations, probably on all sides here. And the outcome of this PFAS process is difficult to foresee now. But if we go back to the 1960s and see that more or less all new proposals that have come up have met resistance, it has not changed as in climate policy, where forerunner companies are now pushing politicians to do a bit more, increasingly. We still have this pro and con in the field of chemicals policy, but since 1960s, at the end of the day, these new policies, sometimes more stringent, sometimes weaker than proposed, have actually been enacted. So if you look a few years ahead, I'm pretty confident that there will be a new, more stringent REACH regulation. Might take another 5 years, might take 3 years, and there will be restriction of a number of PFASs in one way or another, even though some of what has been proposed now from these member states will probably not survive going through this regulatory tunnel. So again, we're back in a quite interesting period, and being a scientist here is well, you get a lot of empirical material, at least if you're studying decision-making processes as I do. I think I can stop here. Maybe there are some questions before we have breakout rooms.
Thank you, Mikael. That was fascinating. An excellent overview. I was just wondering, before I don't know if we have any questions in the chat yet, but before we turn it over to others in the audience, if I could just ask a question. You're referring to this issue of political shifts, for example, further and further to the right within the European Union and its member states, and how that is having ramifications on environmental issues, environmental policies, and the level of ambition in various countries. So countries like Denmark and Sweden, who have been leaders on the issues of chemicals for many years, how do you see these shifts affecting the issue of climate versus the issues of chemicals? I mean, is there a distinction there, or are we seeing kind of the same risks to all environmental issues?
It's a very good question. It's evident that if we call them so, I mean, right-wing populists that sometimes outright deny climate change as being a scientific fact, focus on that issue because it has or might have implications on consumption, on individuals, on using your car, eating your steak, etc., etc. So therefore, it's easy to sort of criticize climate taxes and say that this will ruin more or less everything. I don't think there is a similar critical starting point per se when it comes to chemicals as such. And if I take the right-wing populistic neo-Nazi Sweden Democrats, they have actually sometimes been asking for bans. Why don't we ban all parabens? They said once, and I said, what? Why should we do that? Yeah, you know, they're industrial made. Yeah, and you need to ban quite many substances in that case. So I don't think they are very interested in that, but they are, of course, listening to industry, and they want to confront, let's say, green politicians, which means that if green politicians support chemicals policy is bad per se. I think that's how it sort of comes up on the political agenda, even though if you look at their political programs, it's much more about transport, food, agriculture, and so on. Another consequence is that, without having looked into this into detail in any European country, in all the EU countries, but in the cases I know, usually they dismantle public expenditures, the state budget, in the field of environment, which means that you cut down resources on agencies all over the place. That, of course, has an impact, which in many ways is not problematic only from health and environment point of view, because those suffering from more lengthy processes are, of course, also companies, and at the end of the day, consumers who want to use substitutes. We'll see now this, the election in the parliament might be very critical, because there is a risk, based on my values, that some of the neo-fascist parties, or those who are openly fascistoid or even have a Nazi background, they dress in suit and tie and behave and say, we're not racist, we just think that immigration is too high, we're not racist, And the better they sort of behave, the easier it is for the, let's call them the normal conservative parties, to collaborate to the right. And if you draw up, if you sort of, you can look at, there are two scenarios, which would be, the outcome would be just as huge differences between Biden and Trump. I mean, it's not small changes of policies that you can expect then. It's rather, and in another project where we'll look at this environmental policy backlash in different countries, Brexit or not, Biden or Trump, right to left wing in European Parliament, Bolsonaro or Lula in Brazil, very small, thin margin, a few percent. But it's not like 10, 15, 20 years ago when policies were going in the same direction, but in different ways, different strategies, different vehicles, perhaps with plateaus and undulating waves. Now it's very abrupt policy shifts where you sort of change 180 degrees from one day to another. And that's very difficult for everybody to orient themselves. In the field of climate policy in Sweden, the present government is dismantling what they just 1.5 years ago agreed on completely, which is extremely problematic for energy companies. There are no long-term policies. How can you invest? How can you plan? How can we cope with climate transformation if policies are shifting like that?
It's so interesting, Mikael. Thank you. Joe commented in the chat here. It's interesting to hear. I always thought Sweden and the EU were much more progressive in their policies related to climate change and sustainability, but it seems they're up against the same problems and right-wing versus left-wing polarization that we face in the US. And yeah, it is a little bit surprising for us. We have a couple questions related to PFAS that I want to go ahead and pose before we do a breakout. So Gabrielle asks, after your recent comments, do you think ECHA is on track to ban PFAS as a group? Will fluoropolymers take longer?
I can just say to Joseph's comments, we're not there yet. It will take a number of years to sort of dismantle what has been built up in both Sweden and EU. But with the same policy 10 years from now, definitely Sweden and EU will not be forerunners. when it comes to ECHA, I don't dare to say, but the experience is that when a few member states, as we have seen on bisphenol A, as we have seen on brominated flame retardants, as we have seen on other substances in the past, when a few member states are really up and running, pushing, and the rest have very different views, usually that succeeds in delivering new policies. It's also so that if member states have different views and take different initiatives or do national bans or push EU agencies like ECHA, then the Commission gets a good motive for saying, look, we can't have this, we're the same union. Let's take a sort of, not federal, but a union-wide initiative. And that's how substances over time actually have been restricted, that individual member states have started a process that eventually has been a EU-wide outcome of. So, but what ECHA will say based on these different risk assessments, socioeconomic committees, that is very difficult to foresee. They might say something that will not, at the end of the day, all these assessments go into a committee reflecting member states. So the member states will decide, and I would be very surprised if nothing would come out from this. I assume that would be the case. But if this is a breakthrough for managing substances per se, per default, based on group, I'm not sure. Maybe there will be a number of such group-focused processes before we will have sort of a breakthrough point for group classification in the EU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. Beth asks, she said, The Guardian recently reported that the U.S. chemical industry likely spent $110 million lobbying against PFAS regulations, particularly with a focus on drinking water standards. You mentioned pushback from the chemical industry in the EU. Is it at the similar level and target?
I actually, this came, I just tried, because I expected this. I saw this just an hour ago when I prepared this, because it was published when I was in Brussels. I haven't read through, but we know clearly that in the REACH enactment process, the American Chamber of Commerce and other players from the US were really investing heavily in trying to slow down, or some in the brief period they wanted to sort of kill REACH completely, because they were fearing that, considering the size of the European market, if EU would go for REACH, and REACH is actually 30 years younger than TSCA, then there will be a push to amend TSCA in the US. And there were a number of good proposals for that. Lautenberg's proposal for a Kid Safety Act, Chapter 5, and so on. But you know that much better than I do, but that wasn't what came out. But still, what happened in the EU had ramifications globally, not only in the US, but also elsewhere. So I guess it's the same now for PFAS. So we have this huge pressure from lobbyists from different corners of the world. So if you can tell them that there are substitutes that they can chill down, that would be very helpful.
Yes, and we've had some success with that, and certainly that's going to be a focus of ours moving forward. And I'm sure, the industries joining us today who are using PFAS are also really, actively looking for safer alternatives. And it's a challenge, we know, but there is definitely work moving forward there. Okay, so I just posted in the chat a series of questions that we would like you to discuss in your breakouts. I'm going to open up the breakout rooms in a minute, and I'd like for you all to hopefully, many of you will have already downloaded this document so that you can discuss the questions. Let me just say what those questions are. Which chemicals are you more concerned about and feel you most need to address based on what you've heard? How would you deal with a chemical that to this point has not been a priority for replacement at your facility? Will EU policies change your company's motivation to change? And who in your companies or supply chain do you need to engage to address possible restrictions on chemicals? And what strategies might you employ to encourage that change? So those are questions we'd like you all to discuss in the breakout room. I think we'll keep the breakout open for 10 or so minutes. I will send you all a message when we're ready to close out the breakouts. So if you've had trouble opening up the document, hopefully others in your room have been able to. Please, everybody, if you could take a second to try to download that document, that'll be helpful. And I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout. So go ahead and discuss. All right, everybody, if you could please join the breakout rooms you've been invited into. Mikael, if you're interested in joining a breakout room to hear the discussion and how it's going, please feel free. You're not automatically put into one because I made you a co-host. And
Okay.
for those of you who have not joined your breakout yet, please do so. It looks like everyone's there.
I'll go and fetch a cup of coffee first.
Please do. Thank you.
Sorry for lengthy answers to the question.
Oh, no. People are really interested in your perspective, so I really appreciate it.
Those EU questions, EU chemicals was the right thing to do and would also have less impact when they try to transfer technology to the European countries. And also, for some people, it's keeping not only their customers happy, but their customers' customers happy. And a strategy would be, or people to get included, R&D definitely, tech transfer groups, and the strategy we thought was a setup, maybe TUR planning. So we had a really good discussion. There were people from different industries, so it really kind of showed a broad band of how people were going to respond to these questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Lucy. All right, well, I think if anyone else wants to maybe share some of their thoughts in the chat, that would be one option for how to still collect some of the information that people were kind enough to share. So we have a little less than 30 minutes left, and we did want to get to a little bit of the global developments as well. So if we could maybe now turn again to Mikael.
Yeah.
To talk a little bit about the global level.
Yeah, maybe I can just give, since I heard from Pam, who was in a couple of groups, also one additional comment about this PFAS debate or proposal. I mentioned that there were 5,600 plus comments that came. I looked also now at the countries. Interestingly, the number of comments, the comments came from 4,400 something different senders, organizations. Most of the comments came from Sweden and Germany, which is a bit strange considering that Sweden is not that big country and it doesn't have that big chemicals industry. But anyway, so Sweden, Germany, then Japan, Belgium, China, Italy, and the US. In total, I guess comments came from 50 countries, something like that. And looking into a selection of these, I mean, they focus, someone mentioned inks, oils, refrigerants, air condition, engineering, mechanical systems, it's all over the place. So, but I think that what these agencies that submitted the proposal actually want to do is not banning PFAS now and everywhere in all products immediately. It's rather to try to change the starting point. Instead of going for one substance at a time, they want to go with the entire group, and the default is restrict, and restrictions can be, of course, partial, focus on sectors, products or so, but the default should then be restriction unless you show that, well, this variety is okay, or that use is, we had this debate about essential use, for instance, and so on. So it's turn things upside down. What's the starting point? I think you should regard the sort of initiative from that point of view, even though it might not be stated. Of course, they need to state that this is problematic everywhere. These two committees will now go through all the 5,000 comments, each of them, and see if they are evidence-based. And if so, they will follow the logic in REACH, the different provisions, and one of those concerns whether or not there are substitutes. And depending on the answer, the conclusion will differ. Then this will go and be fed into the Commission's comments and the member state machinery. So it will take quite some time. But don't interpret this as, I mean, a bunch of EU member states and probably the entire EU will ban all fluorinated substances. I don't think that's the intention. So just to see, as clarification. Okay, so a bit briefer then on this global level, and I mean, I'm not following this as closely at all as I follow EU processes, but from start we have, besides a lot of declarations in international summits on sustainable development or environment and development, talking about or asking for sound management of chemicals or sound science, which in my view as a scientist is a bit tautological, because if you say sound science, that implies that there is something called unsound science, and that wouldn't be science, of course. But we have the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions. We have the Minamata Convention, and after the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, we had the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, SAICM, which, and I know, Bashkut, you have been working more on this than I've been working on it, but I would say that it was promising. SAICM was, when it came, felt that, yes, eventually now we will have something perhaps similar to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the Convention on Biodiversity, or Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention, under which you can sort of put new protocols and so on. So SAICM could be turned into a convention or a regime that the European Union asked for in Rio +20 in 2012 and so on. That didn't turn out to be the case, and now we have a new approach with the global framework on chemicals coming up, which in this conference in Uppsala a couple of weeks back, I would say that all those who have been involved in that process looked at it very positively and said, now we will have the framework will be in place for global collaboration on these issues, and now we will be able to solve a lot of things. I don't want to be a pessimist, but my realistic conclusion is that no, I don't think that will be the case. I think that legal frameworks are needed on the international level, and Rotterdam is not so relevant for the types of chemicals we're talking about now. Basel is about waste. The Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants has muscles, can lead to improved chemicals control, but is dependent on adding substance by substance and amending in lengthy processes, etc., etc. So, I mean, REACH is like a high-speed train compared to the Stockholm Convention, even though it has this global grasp in a way. So for that reason, I have for a number of years been now and then sort of asking for, promoting the idea of having a global framework convention on chemicals. How you scope that, well, that can be discussed, of course. There are benefits from resource efficiency point of view, from health and environmental point of view, and also in terms of creating a level playing field for companies and making trade easier. So globalized reach was something we talked about previously, and even chemicals industry in Europe said yes, that would be of interest. But what has happened now more recently then is that the United Nations Environment Assembly in March last year talked about the need for an internationally binding legal treaty on plastic pollution. And since then, a discussion has been ongoing, and a debate to some extent, where there is a network of scientists saying that, look, plastic pollution is not only about the physical properties of plastics, it's also about the monomers, it's about the additives, it's about the chemical substances in there that are not only the polymers. So, these negotiations, as Bashkut mentioned in his introduction, there have been a couple of meetings in Uruguay and France, and next week, I think it is, there will be a third meeting. And now there is a zero draft, which I would just summarize as sort of promising to deal with the fact that we have 13,000 substances or more in plastics. There are three main options in this draft. One is sort of to eliminate whatever that is. We want to eliminate plastic pollution, just to summarize that, or to minimize. And the third option is more, let's leave it up to the countries to decide how to work on this. That's more framework character of that treaty. What this will lead to is very difficult to say. But so far, I think, considering how these international negotiations in other cases unfold and develop, it has gone quite well and rapidly, and stakeholders have been listening to each other, always with a lot of, I mean, obstacles and disagreements and so on, and nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. But if I just, without sort of following the nitty-gritty details, but if I sort of lean back and compare this with other similar processes I've seen in the last three decades, it's going pretty well. Which means that there might actually be an agreement on plastic pollution. Things can, of course, happen. I mean, if Putin is pressing the wrong red button, or if Trump will come back in the US, or if we will have a new European Commission president like Juncker before. If geopolitical tensions or whatever will sort of be mirrored in these negotiations, things can be blocked. There is a bit of risk that I see, that on the one hand, groups, both companies, downstream users, and environmental organizations, scientists, they want to establish a link to fossil fuels being the sort of raw material for the plastic society. I think one reason for that is to get leverage and support from the understanding in the climate context that fossil fuels are, bad from many points of view, which is understandable from a rhetoric point of view and so on. Scientifically, it's solid. Politically, though, if we see increased problems in coming to agreement on how to further develop what was decided in the Paris Agreement in 2015, and now we will have the conference in Dubai. Probably also the next conference on the parties will be in Dubai for different reasons. If we see increasing tensions there between the big players, then those tensions about fossil fuels might sort of have an influence on the negotiations on the plastic treaty, if that link is established too strongly, and that might slow things down. If the players in climate policy think that, okay, now they're taking the back door via plastic, and in that way want to influence the use of fossil fuels. That's just something that I'm observing. So I think I can stop there. Maybe you want to complement with something, Bashkut, since you've been involved in this context for a number of years as well.
No, thanks, Mikael. I think you really nailed it. We're seeing in the other chemical treaties, the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, countries that have been largely silent on issues up to this point, such as Saudi Arabia and other fossil fuel producing nations, stepping up and being more vocal and aligning themselves with other countries that are of a mindset of slowing down the global process of global restrictions. What I find interesting about the plastics treaty is well, there are many things that I find interesting, but one of them is its potential to be perhaps the broadest chemical convention that we have, covering the most substances, not just the monomers, but also the additives. It really would be a tremendous treaty in its scope. And yet, if you look at the zero draft and you look at what they have actually put down on paper in terms of the architecture of this treaty to restrict 16,000 additives and however many other chemical products may be potentially in the scope of the treaty, there's hardly anything there. It's 2 paragraphs for 3 different options on chemicals in plastics. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. After this session, there will be 2 more rounds of negotiations planned, which in theory would conclude sometime next year, which is not any time really for 190 plus countries to agree on what would be the world's biggest treaty for chemicals. Yeah, I don't know what you think about that, Mikael, but it does seem daunting to me.
Maybe one reason why it's going smoothly comparatively so far is that, these paragraphs are not really stating what will happen in terms of substance. And once, I mean, if you start to include groups of substances or start to write down what these 16,000 are about, I mean, that will trigger a lot of reactions, of course. Yeah, but it is interesting, and plastic is a topic that will not disappear from the agenda. And it is interesting that, as far as I understand from having discussed with a number of the scientists who follow this and go around and attend the meetings, the policymakers have understood that plastic is about concerns much more than the physical pollution that you see in the photos from marine environments where birds are strangled, or I mean, seabirds have plastics in their stomachs, etc. So they have understood there is a sort of chemical dimension to this. It's not only the physical properties and the persistency. There are other aspects as well, and that has been taken on board so far, which wasn't half a year ago. That, I mean, the same persons were really saying, no, we're not going to get the chemical dimension into this treaty. But it has happened. That can disappear again, of course. But plastics will probably not disappear from the political agenda, because it won't disappear out there. People see it every day, that it's a problem, also around the world. Yeah.
Indeed. We have 10 minutes left. Pam, maybe I could ask you for guidance. Would you like to take questions from the audience, or should we go into the breakout groups now?
I was thinking about that, and I thought maybe we could just have a conversation together, rather than go into the breakout group. So great, thanks. So, the questions that we were going to pose for the breakout discussions were two. One, how would you incorporate what you've heard into your consideration of TOR options, and or how you would make recommendations to decision makers to make a change? And then also just to identify where there are research needs that could help you find technically and economically feasible, safer alternatives to the chemicals you're using. So those are the questions we were going to pose for the breakouts. I think maybe we can just have a group conversation, particularly about that first question. How can you incorporate what you've heard into your consideration of your options and recommendations for change in Massachusetts? Or any other question or topic that anyone here would like to discuss. And maybe I'll start with a question in the chat that Joe posed, and anyone else who has a question, if you want to put it into the chat instead, I think that'll be fine. Joe says, TSCA has a process for evaluating new chemicals that are being introduced in the market. Does REACH have a similar process of evaluating new chemicals? And can these rules be tightened on a global basis when it comes to the introduction of perfluorinated chemicals in the market, especially when these man-made chemicals are being introduced almost on a daily basis?
Well, I can say that REACH has the registration and evaluation steps, and the requirements for data in the registration step depends on what's called the volume, which means the weight of substances. Sometimes REACH is described as no data, no market, but I mean, the amount of data or the type of data that's required is sometimes inefficient to be able to conduct the evaluation that REACH is supposed to deliver. And a quite small share of the substances that are registered is evaluated. Evaluations can be done by on EU level by the agencies or by individual member states, and they can pick and choose as they want. But there is nothing automatic leading to the fact that all new substances are evaluated. If you have huge volumes, you need to come up with data that will probably trigger warnings of some kind or another leading to evaluation. If you have smaller volume, that's not at all necessarily the case. To do this globally today, I guess with what we have, that would be the Stockholm Convention, but that would require an amendment and an international negotiation process ending up with formal requirements to ratification in X number of countries before it would be enforced. And to do that for the entire group of PFAS, I think that would be very difficult under the Stockholm Convention.
Mm-hmm. I have a question, Mikael. So the plastics treaty, it's wonderful to hear you feeling, fairly optimistic about how that's moving forward. And I think you're right. It's very important that it be more than just the physical characteristics of the plastic waste. Do you have a sense of any specific additives that are more likely to be highlighted in this?
No, I am not at all. I haven't followed it in any detail, but and there is nothing in the documents that can give you an idea of that. But I know that in the discussions around, these meetings that take place, there are always, sessions, workshops, reports, position papers, working papers, and a lot of other information coming from, for instance, from the scientific community to policymakers. So there's a learning process here as well. And that's what I was positively surprised that they sort of understood this, let's call it then the chemical dimension. For those of you who are chemists, it's ridiculous to say so, but if you sort of the physical aspects of the polymers that can strangle a seal compared to the additives that can leak and disperse in different ways. So that, in my understanding, reflects a learning among diplomats and policymakers, which has been, it was unexpected. But maybe if you look at this scientific coalition have a website under the ICHAP, which is the International Knowledge Hub against plastic pollution. And there you can find the policy papers and submissions from the sort of scientific community. And maybe you can see there what they sort of push for. And quite often, if you have, well, this and this should happen, and then you have the exemplification based on a problem, health problem, or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But I think it's way too early to say how this will end up. But I would be very surprised if the outcome would cover 13,000 substances in all plastics around the world with any strength. But maybe you can think about that there might be provisions saying, just as the framework conventions do in the UN context, that parties recognize that there is a problem, parties recognize that they need to collaborate, parties recognize that they need to invest in science, that they need to support institutes like Curie to develop substitutes, that they, that's that kind of recognition. And then probably processes will be set up for agreement groups or specific types or so. I think you take it in small steps. You don't eat, you eat an elephant in small steps.
Great. We just have a couple of minutes. I wanted to just see if anybody had any pressing question they'd love to pose to Mikael while we have somebody with such wonderful insight into global policies. And really, Mikael, it's been so fascinating to hear your interpretation of things that we maybe have, you know, read in little emails or perhaps looked at policies, but not necessarily understood quite as well. Thank you for including your email address in the chat. But any final questions, anybody in the room, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. I think perhaps we're all a little overwhelmed. So thank you. It says this has truly been very interesting. Bashkut, any final words from you?
No, just to say thank you. Thank you, Mikael. It's always a pleasure to hear your thoughts on these issues. And thank you very much for taking the time to share those with us. And thank you to everyone for what I thought was a very interesting discussion, both in the breakout group and here in the plenary. So thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for listening. I think that the initiative you have and the collaboration and being able to gather this group, there is nothing similar as far as I know in Sweden, for instance. So it's inspiring also the network activities you're having. So thanks for having me.
Terrific. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us. It's 10:30. We really appreciate that. You will be getting a survey, probably not until sometime next week. Please be patient with us. But you're kind of used to that process, I hope. And do feel free to reach out to Mikael if you have any questions, or to anyone at Turi or elsewhere in the Tura program. Have a wonderful day. See many of you this afternoon. Okay. Thanks again, Mikael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.